My name is Sabine Loos, like Jack said. I'm at University of Michigan, and I was asked to talk about human factors, equity, risk modeling. And so what I landed with is prioritizing context of place and use in disaster risk modeling. A bit more about me, since it's nice to know who's talking to you. I lead AID Labs at U of M. It's a really kind of bright and inspiring group of people. We have engineers, but we also have geographers and data scientists and sociologists, can you imagine, in our group, and we're all so excited. I built a mini Surrey at Michigan, and we're partnering with a bunch of organizations around the world to design disaster information. But a lot of the motivation for this work, like Jack said, started at Stanford. Even Barb just mentioned death dollars and downtime, and I was really thinking about the way that we were quantifying the impacts of earthquakes, and I started to formalize that thinking through actual research studies that I'm going to present today. The first research study is empirical work I conducted with the U.S. Geological Survey and the National Hazard Center at CU Boulder, where we studied what is the use of seismic loss models, specifically the U.S. Geological Survey's PAGER system for decision making. And we wanted to focus on equity-focused decision making. And then the second study is more recent. It's in collaboration with the Toronto Climate Observatory and the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery at the World Bank. And we flipped the script and we asked people who are modelers or team members, community engagement and specialists who are involved in equity-focused risk assessment projects and asked them how their experience was. So really, this work is meant to represent all of us here, especially those of us who have been doing a lot of deep community-engaged research and thinking about people in our work. So I hope to represent all of our thinking. So my question is, how can we design disaster risk models to be equity-focused? And I'll talk about what that means. But my answer is we really need to prioritize context in this work. So I'm going to talk about 3 areas of work. We talked a lot about these models and the metrics and the way we quantify disasters. Then I'm going to get a little meta. So I'm going to talk about the design of a model. And then I'm going to talk about design of the modeler. And our motivation for this work is essentially something that's kind of been hinted at throughout the day, which is the fact that disasters cause disproportionate impacts on groups that have been historically made vulnerable. In the earthquake world, an example is from the recent earthquake in Afghanistan in 2023. We saw that more than 90% of the fatalities occurred to women and children. Or in my backyard in Michigan, we face a lot of flooding that's repeated and recurrent. And the areas and neighborhoods where flooding happens are the neighborhoods that are the lowest resourced. Now, I say made vulnerable because it's not like these populations are inherently weaker. In fact, I believe women actually have a longer lifespan than men. But the case is that these gender differences in mortality, they're really context-specific and societally driven. So the example from the Afghanistan earthquake, it could be due to, in many contexts around the world, sometimes women are placed in more caretaking roles where it makes it more challenging for them to evacuate. Or in the case in Detroit, many neighborhoods might have lower resources to put in mitigation measures, and then the flooding is diverted to those neighborhoods. So when I talk about this is all partly an issue of equity. We know that there's inequality in the way that houses are exposed to various hazards, and then also the strength of those different structures. And we want to be able to reach a world in which there is justice and there is not that inequality in access to opportunity or resources. But a step to get to justice is to think about equity, where we start to develop tools and policies that start to fairly allocate resources that acknowledge that inequality exists. And when we think about this fair allocation of resources, that's actually just one form of equity. It's a form called distributive equity, distribution of resources. And in order to do that fair allocation, we need to start thinking about who requires these resources and how can they be supported. And the question that motivated all of this work was, can our risk modeling framework that we've talked about a lot, where we combine our hazard, our exposure, our physical vulnerability, and our consequence metrics, support decisions that support distributive equity? So my first question is, how do we design models that support distributive equity? Now, I'm building off of a lot of history today, so we can zoom into something that a lot of others have mentioned. Specifically, Stefan Hollegat at the World Bank started this report where a commonly identified limitation of our traditional risk modeling methods is that they focus on quantifying asset-based losses, right? We're quantifying the economic losses associated to the damage to physical infrastructure assets. Now, the critique here is that prioritizing economic losses prioritizes those who already have assets to begin with. Or in the case of our work, when we talked to practitioners that are thinking about vulnerable populations, they're like, okay, great, economic impacts, I guess they're fine, but we also want to know about societal impacts, and we want to know how can we care for people who are still living in this community. So a prevalent way to address this limitation has been to quantify another consequence instead of asset-based losses. And we've been doing this for ages, right? Starting in the early 2000s out of MCER, this commonly meant quantifying resilience. And this concept, as we've seen today, it's really been super well developed out of the Bloom Center in Surrey, where we're looking at modeling or simulating restoration or recovery of physical infrastructure assets. So now a lot of modelers are actually expanding this idea of quantifying alternative metrics of impact to more directly address these issues of inequality. So going back to that unbreakable model from Stefan Hollegat, they have proposed the idea of well-being or welfare losses, also mentioned earlier today, where it accounts for the different value of a dollar between poor and rich households. This idea has really been built upon out of the Surrey group as well, Maria Markvita and several others. We also see metrics like population displacement, where we're focusing on people and how they might be dislocated and move and then might return after a disaster. This is work led by Nicole Paul and several others also from the Bloom Center. And then out of the world, from the Society for Risk Analysis, that's also doing a lot of risk analysis work, we're seeing really cool and innovative ways to model access to essential services. So going back to what Abby Lyle said, essential services could be things like daycares and schools. And what we found in our work is that all of these consequences really, they do support distributive equity. An example is a humanitarian funder might be able to reallocate how they distribute money after major events around the world based on these contextual factors in addition to asset-based losses. And the metrics that really resonated with most users that we talked to were the ones that were, again, actionable for caring for living populations. And this often meant the people-focused ones, population displacement and access to essential services. And overwhelmingly, kind of even before we get into our impacts that are conditioned on damage, practitioners just wanted to know who was exposed to high hazard. So just combining your hazard and population exposure, and in this case for a federal emergency manager, is there a way to slice and dice and show the per capita income or renters or et cetera? So when we start getting into exposure and population exposure, that's when it's like, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to disaggregate. I don't know who might live in a community. And so that's when we get into another layer of equity, which is called procedural equity. Procedural equity is the idea of who do you take into your decision-making process, and how can we integrate that into our modeling process? So the next question is, how do we design processes that integrate communities into a model? Because a reason that we've observed this varying utility and the risk modeling metrics that we've seen with these wide users is because we've implicitly transported this tool that was really, really useful in some contexts into this wider context of use, which is awesome, right? We have HAZIS and is able to support a lot of emergency managers. But sometimes when things transport, or technology transports, it doesn't necessarily always stick with these new user groups. So now what we're thinking about is, what if we design the actual process to understand the context of how a new tool might be used and the place in which it is used, and then do that before designing a model. So an example that's been brought up a lot today, but I just want to call it out again, is the Spur San Francisco study, because the city of San Francisco essentially started with this really values-based goal of, hey, we want to mitigate against displacement after the next big earthquake. And that informed a lot of unique models that were developed. I'm specifically showing Ann Halsey's work with Professor Baker and Professor Dearline, where they modeled community functionality at scale. But kind of a level up of that idea. So instead of saying, hey, the user wants this type of information, and us modelers will take that and crunch the numbers and provide that information. A really cool initiative was the Tomorrow's Cities initiative, also led in part by Gemma Kremen, who's here in the audience, where they bring in planners and emergency managers and community representatives in this future visioning exercise. And they try to envision together, what might our future city look like as we adapt to risks? And then that type of future visioning directly inputs into the model. So it's a really collaborative exercise that I would encourage you to check out. Now, in our lab, we do a lot of these kind of structured processes, but then we kind of play around with wacky ideas such as unstructured engagement. And so an example is the climate data field lab, where the idea was, can we just put together a bunch of interested people, whether they be activists or artists or policymakers or engineers or data scientists, and they're all interested in a very similar goal. In this case, it was climate data in the Himalayan region. And let's see what solutions they might come with over some unstructured period of time. And then finally, I think we should talk about the idea of committing to a community. So I started my PhD here, and I started doing work in Nepal, and I've been working there for nearly 10 years now. And just through that kind of continued engagement, making friends who are in Nepal, visiting almost every year, once or twice a year, I've come to understand, what they really care about is landslide risk, and how they think about landslide risk is actually thinking about the risk of isolation. And so now I'm bringing in my students to kind of experience that, understand this community, and Bloom alum Major Zhang has been so tenacious in translating that understanding of landslide risk into quantifying landslide isolation. So I think these kind of really context and use-driven approaches should be stated and called out and maybe codified, because what it results in is metrics that are super relevant to a community. But they can also result in models that kind of look completely different from our existing framework. So, for example, a lot of us might be familiar with social vulnerability indices, a completely different framework from our risk modeling framework. And that grew out of an emerging need from emergency managers after Hurricane Katrina. And then sometimes the developed solutions are not necessarily the models themselves. So these are outputs from the Climate Data Field Lab, and you have art, board games, remote sensing. And on the left, we have Sweta Sijabati, who is an employee at Geohazards International, led by Veronica Cedillos. And she created a beautiful infographic pamphlet and a prototype for some public art to communicate landslide risk in Western Nepal. So I've talked about procedural equity, and I talked mostly about kind of the users of models. But now I'm going to flip the script and think about who is the modeler. So how can we help current and future models conduct this kind of more socio-technical disaster modeling practice? Because the fact of the matter is, I was trained as an engineer. I hang out with a lot of seismologists and geologists, or computer scientists and sociologists and anthropologists that have all studied hazards and disasters for about the same amount of time as we have. And our traditional risk assessments, especially in maybe insurance industry, they're really well coordinated. We figured out how to coordinate maybe the hazard modelers and the engineers under one industry, and they're very able to coordinate with a client or an individual that might buy insurance. So this is work led by one of my students, Simone Curtis, who's trying to understand the structures of these risk assessment processes. Because we're kind of in this new phase of risk assessment where we're doing more equity and community-based risk assessment projects. This could be from international organizations such as the World Bank or the UN or city planning. And you have your technical modelers, but you also have a lot of social scientists or community engagement specialists and anthropologists. And they're all trying to understand each other's languages, work together, and then really support the resilience of potentially affected communities. And it gets really challenging to manage all of these pieces, and it requires a lot of empathy and understanding and communication with one another. And so currently, what we're doing is we're building a community of technical and social researchers and practitioners to start to build this type of engagement and talking with each other and figuring out these approaches. So when we do go into those projects, we're more prepared. We hope to have a potential in-person meeting in the University of Michigan. If you are interested, please come find me. And then we also have a special issue out that gathers all of these current approaches and best practices. Again, if you're interested in submitting, please do, or come find me. But then as I'm now an assistant professor, I think a lot about how can we train the next generation to think across these disciplines. So this is a slide I took from Jack directly, but Surrey was really informative for my growth and learning. I could learn from so many of these disciplines just really informally, but also formally through classes and the disaster resilience seminar that's me leading in, and I've heard Mia Lockheed is maybe leading now in the future. But yes, it's such a wonderful and inclusive place, and I think that it was built on the inclusivity that we've heard from the Bloom Center. And so what we've done at Michigan is try to bring that into a formalized graduate program called Hazards, Risk, and Resilience, where students take core classes in spatial data analysis, disaster risk modeling, but also just kind of theories of social vulnerability where they don't touch data at all. And the goal is to build more convergent disaster risk modelers that can enter this new phase of risk assessment projects more intelligibly. So I started with this goal of how can we design disaster risk models to be more community-based and equity-focused. And I think we started with the model, and there's a lot of really cool things we can do in just the modeling space. But then I want to encourage us to think about how can we actually formalize that engagement with communities around the model. And I think what we really care about is people, right? And making and helping people be more resilient to the disasters. So how can we put people at the center of our modeling experience? With that, there are many people here that are part of this community of practice that I would like to thank, especially many of us who are current and former Bloom alum. And if you have any questions, please reach out.